Yeah. So we'll get started. I want to introduce all of my friends that are watching to one of my heroes and great friends, Rob Morris. Let's give you a little professional intro. Rob Morris is the president and co-founder of Love 146, an international human rights organization working to end child trafficking and exploitation. Prior to co-founding Love 146, Rob worked with Mercy Ships International directing training schools at the International Operations Center. He has lectured and taught in over 20 countries on issues of justice, compassion, human rights, and has been featured in the Huffington Post, the CNN Freedom Project, Forbes, WNPR, Alec Baldwin's Here's the Thing podcast on WNYC, Fox News, and more. So I know how much Rob loves for me to read those kinds of accolades.
Yeah,
Yeah. So
I'm
thank you.
somebody.
You are capital S
Yeah,
somebody.
right. Yeah,
I'm glad that you are with me, Rob, and it's a pleasure to have you. And thank you, and thank your family for letting you have some time with us tonight.
absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate it.
I
Yep.
miss our breakfasts and lunches, Rob. I can't wait till this is over so we can go back to faux spice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yep. Now it's like chips in my bedroom while I'm doing Zoom conference calls.
Exactly. Hey, pardon me while I go get a refill of Oreos. Someone else take over the meeting for a second.
Right. Right.
Well, there are three things I wanted to, three topics, themes, if you will, I wanted to talk about with Rob tonight. First is just to maybe share a little bit of personal insight from Rob, just things about his family, a little bit of a maybe behind the scenes personal look into his life, his family. And then I wanted to talk about some of his work at Love 146 during this COVID-19 pandemic. And what does it look like to continue to work for justice and to end all trafficking and exploitation? And then, thirdly, I wanted to talk with Rob about spirituality. And Rob has given a number of great talks at our church, Gateway Christian Fellowship in West Haven, Connecticut. He's carried three themes over the 6 years that Rob has been speaking at our church. The themes are hope and compassion and who is your neighbor. And he's eloquent and passionate and articulate and well knowledged. And more than anything, he has a heart that burns for these issues and lives these issues. And so I often think that Rob is going to come to our church and he is going to share a great message. It's going to be challenging, it's going to be humorous. But more than anything, what I love about Rob is that he is a living epistle of these things, he and his wife and his family. So I'm always excited when Rob comes and breaks off a piece of his life and gives it to us. Um, Rob, I would love for you just to give us an update during this COVID-19 crisis. Would you give us just an update on your family and as I mentioned to you earlier, how is your most important work doing?
Yeah, and that is the most important work, right? Yeah, I think it's been, I mean, for everyone, right? Everybody on the planet is trying to figure out um, a new path, right? A new way of working, a new way of living that nobody has been down before, right? So it's all uncharted territory. So even as a family, trying to figure that out. So right now, I mean, we have a family of nine. My two oldest kids are no longer in the house. They do live in the area, but there's seven of us right now living 24/7 in our home, and so that is full of beauty. It's messy. It's fun. It's challenging, but all in all, it's been really good. We have our oldest daughter that's home with us right now is an EMT, and so she's been working really long hours on an ambulance, and that's been hard for her. I think it's been challenging, and yeah, obviously there's concerns that we have for her, and for her coming back and forth in and out of the house. There's always that wondering is, yeah, what's this going to look like?
You have a pressure washer at the door that you require her to
Right,
use?
my poor daughter. We've just, when she comes in at night, it's like, there's a routine, right? Take your shoes off outside, and we have to sanitize the doorknobs after she comes. And she goes through this whole process after she brings the ambulance back anyway,
Yeah.
at work. So she desanitizes and does, or sanitizes when she's
Yeah.
in at work, but we make her do it all again. It's like, you get in the shower. It's just, yeah, it's crazy. So anyway, and a couple of our kids, we have concerns around their immune systems and all of
Yeah.
that. So there's obviously some concerns there, but all in all, we're doing well. Trying to find a new rhythm was challenging, especially the first couple of weeks. How to do the whole school thing. I mean, school teachers have been dealing with the same challenges of trying to find out how to do a new way of educating. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
so we're all in that. We've got kids that are can do it on their own, and then my wife is working with our two youngest and helping them navigate online learning. And yeah, it's been good. It's been challenging for sure. But
What's been what do you think has been the most surprising challenge for you during this time of social distancing? Particularly,
oh,
related to the home life, something you didn't foresee and it kind of popped up as a challenge.
actually, I would have to say, I wouldn't say that it's the challenge has surprised me. I think I was expecting it to even be more challenging.
Okay.
Um, I've actually I've actually really loved being home with my family more. As you know, I do a lot of traveling.
Yeah.
That's done now, right? So I haven't been traveling for 2 months, and that's actually been really good. It's been good for me. I think it's been good. I hope it's been good for my family. Um,
Can we
so
get your wife on this Zoom?
right, right.
Nothing
Actually, I
like
mean,
having your husband at home when you're not used to it.
it's interesting, right? Because that has been a challenge in the past. Like when I've traveled and I've been away for any length of time, my wife hits a routine, right? I come back home and I'm the interrupter, right? I interrupt it. It's like, oh my gosh, we just had a routine, and bam, I'm in there, So now it's trying to figure out a whole new.
Yeah.
That's why I call it a rhythm. It's like finding that rhythm where it's just like, all right, this is working. We've got
Yeah.
some kind of sense of what a day is going to look like.
Yeah.
But even that is constantly being interrupted. So yeah.
Has there been a joyful surprise being home? And maybe it's what you just described. Just
Yeah, I think
love
that's
being
it. I
with my
think I just
family a little bit.
love being with my kids. I love being with my wife. It's just been, yeah, it's just been really, really good. It's been that part of this season has been, I think, a really healthy season, and walking through, dealing with fear, you know, together as a family, right? 'Cause, everyone processes differently. And when you're all squashed together, seven of us in one place, everybody deals with things differently, and trying to navigate some of that. It's interesting. Our prayer, my wife and I, when we pray together at night, it's like our prayer has just come down to a word now, and it's just mercy.
Yeah.
Just mercy. God, have mercy on us. Have mercy on our family, our friends, our neighbors. Have mercy on the world. And it's just been this, yeah, interesting territory for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I was talking with a friend today, and that idea of simplifying prayer
Hmm.
uh, has really elevated. Like, Lord, I don't have the emotional energy. I don't have the vocabulary to to pray these sort of lengthy prayers. They are these 1, 2, 3 word prayers, and that's like, Lord, that's all I got,
Yeah.
and I think that's enough.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, do you have more free time on your hands? Or when I talk to my pastor friends, they're like, dude, I've never worked this hard. Like, I haven't worked this hard in years.
Yeah.
Is that something that's translating to you as well? Do you feel like you're working harder than before? Or do you feel like I do have a lot more free time on my hands?
Well, I mean, between you and I, I'm actually getting more done.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Moving from an office space, and where my desk is in the middle of a hallway in an office.
Yeah.
So, there's always something happening. But I having to figure out a new way of working, and especially because my job specifically has shifted so much, has made me become way more intentional, for sure. And I think, I mean, one of the things I was talking with our staff about, over the last few weeks, is that what will be a key to our survival as a charity in these really hard times. And I mean, it's going to get tough. It's going to get really tough. And you're in the same boat. Church is in the same
Yeah.
sort of place. Like, what does this mean? Not knowing completely what it all looks like. The key is going to be flexibility. And so being flexible with work hours, being flexible with giving yourself some grace if you're not getting done what you were hoping to get done or whatever, just recognizing that, hey, everyone recognizes we're living in a different world right now. And it's interesting because my thought process has so changed, even in the 6 weeks. So we closed our offices down 6 weeks ago. And so we've been doing this remote working thing since then. The first couple of weeks, Lance, I was like, internally, there was this whole feeling of like, man, I can't wait till things get back to normal. And I've seen over, especially the last 3 or 4 weeks or so, this complete shift in me to, you know what? First of all, I don't think things will ever go back to normal the way things used to be. So starting to change my way of thinking on that, instead of this longing for things to go back to what normal looked like 7 weeks ago, now there's this almost an excitement building of like, hey, what is the new normal going to look like? And right now, how can I be part of shaping some of that and actually having some say in what the new normal looks like? So, five of our 7 kids have been adopted. And so in the adoption world, that terminology of a new normal is used often, right? That every time you bring a new child into your family, depending on the circumstances of why that child is coming into the family and what circumstances they came from, to be placed into your family, all of those things, you sort of get ready for there's going to be a new normal. Your family's never going to look like it did before this. So what is the new normal going to look like? And the illustration that I often heard in the adoption world is this, like, with when you have an infant, there's this mobile that you'll put over their crib to stimulate them and stuff. Maybe a little carousel, with little carousel horses, and it's spinning and spinning. If you add another horse to that thing or another element to that mobile, it does this, it wobbles, right?
Yeah.
But eventually it starts to do this, and then it's smooth again, right? And so that's kind of where I think we're at right now. Our family, I think family life, work life, all of that there's this wobbling at first of like, whoa, what's going on? All the unknowns, uncharted territory, and financial hits, and really hard things. There's going to be a new normal. And so we can actually be part of shaping some of what that looks like. And so, yeah.
When you talk about new normal, let's transition into your work life a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
What does a new normal mean for Love 146? I guess I'm wondering, can you give us an update on your work and how COVID-19 has affected your prevention work? Has it affected the work you do with the legislative section of state government or federal government?
Yeah, so we
into trafficking when there's a global
right
sort of shutdown. Is there a
right.
shutdown in trafficking to some degree? I mean, can you just give us an update on what's happening?
Sure. So right now we're working on 4 continents. So we have work in Asia, survivor care specifically that we do in Asia. In the Philippines, we have boys home, girls home, for children who've been exploited and trafficked. We have survivor care work in the UK. And then we also have survivor care work here in the US. And then we're also doing prevention work here in the US through a prevention education curriculum that's being utilized right now, I think, in 22 states, in juvenile justice agencies, child welfare agencies, in public schools. And then we're also doing prevention work specifically in Madagascar and in Liberia. So we're busy. I mean, since 2000, two, we've been able to reach a little over 57,000 kids through both prevention work as well as survivor care. But what we're seeing right now, and again, this is all uncharted territory, right? So it's like, to me, it's amazing how fast the world changed, right? I mean, you're talking about like really fast,
Yeah.
but like from one day to the next, things are changing so rapidly. And so I'm really grateful that we have this phenomenal team of people who are flexible, who are super creative, very, like, okay, and persevering, right? Just the nature of the work that we do requires some level of grit and perseverance. So I'll give you an example. So in the Philippines, we had back in January, we've gotten kind of taken a double hit in the Philippines. In January, the volcano, the Taal volcano erupted in the Philippines. It was global news. And that volcano, we were within the danger zone. Our safe homes were in the danger zone. So we had to evacuate all of our kids from the safe homes to get out of there when the volcano happened. And then the big cleanup after it all kind of settled and everything, it was terrifying for our kids, right? And so our staff there had to really walk our kids through the, fear and trauma. And here's the reality is the kids that we work with have experienced levels of trauma that are almost unimaginable for most of us, right? At very young ages, some of them. And so they already are dealing with extraordinary trauma. Then you add something like a volcano erupting, or now in this case, COVID-19, a pandemic. And all of our kids now are in lockdown again. So we just cleaned up from the volcano mess. And then literally less than a month later, we get hit with this. So now all of the kids and all of our staff are now quarantined in our safe home. And they've been there for now, I think it's almost 7 weeks for them. And so them dealing with trauma. And so it's not an easy thing. And so what we're finding too is, and here, even in the States, trauma compounding trauma. So we've had to modify our services. Our services here look like our social workers. They provide wraparound services for kids. So we've provided direct services to over 500 kids right here in the state of Connecticut who are either confirmed or suspected victims of trafficking. And so our social workers that work with these kids and help them navigate child welfare systems, justice systems, all of that stuff, and are so dependent on one-on-one meetings. We've had to modify all of that. So now it's all being done through, texts and video calls and phone calls and checking up and providing things just like gift cards for groceries, making sure there's a roof over kids' heads, or if they're coming from a family and there was a vulnerability in the family because of the struggle to make ends meet or whatever, finding creative ways to meet all of those, even down to now the physical needs of kids, has been really challenging. So, and that's changing all the time. We're modifying and changing and being creative, but recognizing that due to the situation surrounding the lockdown, kids they're no longer being seen by school teachers or school principals or doctors or nurses or the people that normally could potentially spot some signs of exploitation. These kids now are not being seen by those people. And so there's an increased vulnerability. Then there's also more time being spent online. And as most people know, that so much of the exploitation that takes place now happens online. There's a grooming that happens. And so you've got predators as well, spending more time online. It's a perfect storm for exploitation. So trying to stay on top of that has been really challenging. To say the least. And so we just released a PSA that's gone out all over the place, and people are spreading it around, just as far as, cautioning adults as well as children on what to look out for, how to stay safe online. We have great online safety guides for both youth as well as caregivers, parents, and those that are taking care of youth. All of that stuff, we're kicking it up a notch. So
Where can people get that information, Rob? Is that available on your website?
yeah, our resources are all over our website. If you go to love146.org, you can find all kinds of really valuable resources. And we have COVID-19 specific resources as well, that people can access. And even getting that PSA out is an important thing too. So yeah.
Thanks for giving us a great behind the scenes look. I hate to admit it, it's embarrassing, but when I think of trafficking, I often think of, the girls or boys in the back of a,
Yeah.
box vehicle. And
Right. The white van that pulls up in front of the mall and a kidnapping takes
totally,
place.
and I
Yeah.
forget about, I just sort of overlook the grooming aspect,
Yeah.
that whole runway that a trafficker will build
Yeah.
to get access to that kid.
Well, and it's a
And so you're talking about this perfect storm of the more online space, and then teachers aren't able to pick up on these clues and this insight that they're able to look for. That's it's almost a disturbing look a little bit behind the scenes of where we're at right now.
it is disturbing. It's disturbing. And I think what's the most disturbing thing about all of it is the predatory aspect that's involved, right? That there are those who are able to spot and are really good at spotting increased vulnerability and then preying on that. When I was a kid, and this will date me a little bit, but when I was a kid, there was a show that used to be on Sunday nights right before Walt Disney was on. It was called Wild Kingdom, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
Wow. Okay. And it was an old guy named Marlon Perkins. He was sort of the safari guy. And I remember as a kid watching the show, and the shows that would really freak me out were the shows where he would be like, okay, you'd see out on the African plains, you'd see this like herd of antelope or something, or gazelles grazing, and you'd hear Marlon Perkins, oh, look at the pretty gazelles, but look closer in the tall grass surrounding the field. And the camera would zoom in and you'd see the grass moving in. And sure enough, you'd see this lion in the grass creeping toward the edge of the field. And I remember as a kid wanting to like yell through my TV to the antelope or the gazelles, run for your lives. There's a lion in the grass, right? And then sure enough, you'd hear Marlon Perkins, like, oh, there he goes. And you'd see the lion burst out of the grass, and it would go after this herd. And the interesting thing was, and I remember this even now, that the lion would never go after the strongest or the fastest in the herd. The lion is a predator, right? So the lion is able to spot vulnerability. So he would go after the young. He would go after the old. He would go after the infirmed or sick, those that were the most vulnerable, that would drag behind the rest, the strongest of the herd. That's what, and you know what? Human beings, man.
Yeah.
To see that happening, it's incredible. And so you have this increased vulnerability. I remember I met with there was a NYPD officer who headed up the anti-trafficking task force in New York for the NYPD, and he goes, man, the new streets where kids are being exploited is online. It's no longer like the street corner type situation or the whole Liam Neeson narrative, the kidnapping. Those things do happen, and we've seen cases like that. But the grooming and that predatory thing of befriending somebody online, and kids nowadays share everything online, their own vulnerabilities. If they've had a fight with their parents, or they're thinking about running away, or they're struggling with something, or depression or whatever, they share all of that.
Yeah.
And most have no idea who are trolling out there looking for that stuff, and then come in, oh man, I get it, I understand, if you ever need somebody to talk to, I'm here. And there's this building of just and it's the lion in the grass, man. It's the lion in the grass.
As you were talking about that Marlon thing, the lion in the grass, and the predator that stalks, children, I was also thinking sort of three predators have emerged in our story today. The lion in Wild Kingdom, the predator in human trafficking, and the coronavirus is also a predator. It seeks to go after the vulnerable, the weak. Knowing all the deaths that America has experienced, that some have been too young and some have been healthy, but it does feel like the majority of these deaths have been the vulnerable, the older, the weaker. What maybe you've kind of answered this question a little bit. I guess, do you feel like then in this perfect storm, is this a huge disadvantage for your work, or is this actually an advantage, do you think, for what you guys are doing?
As far as the effects of the pandemic,
If you try to say Love 146 in position against this perfect storm that you described caused by the pandemic, kids are more
yeah,
online,
yeah,
teachers are not able to be with students and pick up on clues, counselors are not able to do that. The uncertainty that I think teenagers are feeling, both of being at home or with parents. So you have the arguments and the disconnection. You have the students manifesting their own anxiety or fears that they may not be verbalizing or talking out. And who are they going to talk to? They can't go to a school counselor, right?
right,
So it's texting a friend or texting a stranger online.
yeah.
Do you think that sets you guys up as an advantage? Like, man, it's almost like if I make you the lion in this moment, that you're the predator against the one stalking the kids. Does this actually in some way help you identify them more clearly?
I think it makes it more challenging. I think
Yeah.
it makes it on several levels. I think it's more challenging in that you're not having direct contact like we did
Yeah.
with
Okay.
youth before, and the amount of people that could have their eyes on and be able to identify potential at-risk situations for youth have been limited. And so there are limitations now that we're having to be challenged with that we didn't before and that youth didn't before. And so I think it's actually way more challenging. And on top of that, you also have our staff who are dealing with extraordinarily traumatized youth and children in a time when they have to deal with their own trauma as well,
Yeah.
of dealing with being in a pandemic and having family members get COVID or themselves. We've had at least two people that I know of now on staff that have had it. And so, so you have, I mean, you think about how many people right now are dealing with trauma that never dealt with trauma before, right? There's people now that understand something about the word survivor that they never related to before. We use the terminology survivor all the time in the work that we do because we deal with survivors of child trafficking and exploitation. But that word sometimes is used so flippantly, survivor, survivor, survivor. What it means you've survived something, right? But oh my gosh, what have you survived? It's extraordinary, some of the things that people have survived. Now you're seeing people batten down the hatches that are in survival mode. I mean, for some people, going out and trying to find toilet paper is an act of survival right now, right? It's just like, whoa. But there is an identifying right now with the trauma that's connected to an aspect of trying to survive or trying to make sure that your family is going to survive. People losing their jobs and wondering, how am I going to pay my mortgage or my rent? Or how am I going to get food on the table? There's a survival thing that's starting to kick in that people are identifying with. This is the stuff that our staff deal with themselves, as well as with the youth and the children. So making sure that people are staying healthy, mentally, emotionally. I mean, it's super challenging and all of the unknowns, right? I mean, as a church, you're, I'm sure, wondering, what does this mean? Even how can we sustain this work? I mean, we're dependent upon the generosity of people that give to the work.
Yeah.
And so many people right now are trying to figure out how to put food on the table. So many people are unemployed. And it's just like, we can't be that charity that's out there like, oh, don't forget about us. Don't forget about us. But there are youth who are dependent upon us right now. There are kids that are dependent upon us. And so so there's a lot of like circling trauma in all of this and navigating this. Again, there's no template. Nobody's been through this before. So it's not like we can look historically like, hey, what did charities do back in, no, this is new territory for us. I mean, it's going to be an interesting time for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I was talking with
This
a
isn't
friend.
very hopeful, is it?
No, we're going to get to the hope stuff. We're getting to the hope stuff.
Okay.
We got to make hope have a context. Why does hope matter?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why does hope need to be defiant?
Or perseverance, right? It's like I
Totally.
think it was only, I think, a year, maybe a year and a half ago that it's the first time, and I'm sure I'm late to the game, that I actually saw the word severe in the word perseverance. And I had never seen that before. And it was like this aha moment for me. Of course, perseverance only makes sense within the context of the severity of the circumstances that you're in, right? You never hear somebody in the non-pandemic world or the non-hard times world saying, wow, I'm really persevering. If you're doing great, you don't even think about perseverance.
Yeah.
It's when things are really hard that it's like, okay,
Yeah.
this is severe. What does grit look like now? And yeah, that's a whole nother thing.
Well, and resisting two thoughts. One is resist the temptation to measure your severity against someone else's.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge hole.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to dig out of.
Yeah.
The other thought I had was with a friend today. We were talking, we were sharing a little bit before we went live about a friend of mine whose dad is really battling for his life. And while that's happening today, he found out his aunt, his dad's sister, passed away with coronavirus. I don't know how one measures this, or I don't even know if it's measurable. What was, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 no PTSD, 10 extreme PTSD, what was what would we rate as America's PTSD number 6 months ago? And what will that number be 6 months from now?
Oh, man.
And how do you heal a nation? Yeah. What are going to be the voices that emerge that can put language and not just language to our pain, which is a huge relief. And I think it's a huge place to find healing, that if you can verbalize it, I think that's a big step towards the healing that we need. But someone to actually provide for us the steps and tools needed to take that last little bit to cross the finish line, if you will, of recovery, of some semblance of emotional health and relational health and social health again. So this idea of trauma, Rob, that you're talking about, I don't have a fear for the future, at least of the country we live in and here, because I think there is a resilience to it, and I think we'll find it. I think it'll be a chorus of voices that will help us. Yeah, I'm just curious about that.
I think I think you're flagging something that is, I think, going to be, especially for people like yourself, Lance, and people in pastoral ministry. I think for therapists and mental health professionals, yeah, 6 months, year down the road from now, I mean, we're going to see some pretty intense things, I think, as far as the effects. I mean, they're already talking about, I mean, some of the stats that are coming out now with, as far as people dealing with depression and anxiety and all of that. And then you add to that the physical isolation factor, right? That we're dealing with, where in normal circumstances, it's just like, man, I just need to be with somebody, and you can't right now unless you're with family. But even that, I mean, we're seeing, abuse situations skyrocketing right now, right? People are locked in with abusers, right? People that they can't get away from. And so things like that, it's just, yeah, there's some really challenging roads up ahead for sure.
It's huge. Yep. We did a series here at the church back, I guess it was February, March, called The Gospel and Mental Health. And we're fortunate enough to have a psychiatrist from Yale, whose some specialty is in addictive issues. So she and I together sort of tag teamed each week. And it was really wonderful, because in some of our prep for that, she said, Lance, 1 in 5 Americans deal with a mental health condition that requires some sense of treatment, like it's a significant mental health issue. And I said, okay, her name is Dr. Myra Mathis Uwanago. I said, okay, Dr. Mathis Uwanago, why don't you speak to the 1 in 5 and I'll talk to the 4 in 5? And that seemed to really help us find our lane
Wow.
when we give these public remarks. And I didn't realize sort of how foretelling that series was going to be.
Yeah.
To know like 3 weeks after that series, is our last Sunday morning in our building. So I'm curious about how, churches all across the country, therapists, artists, singers, hopefully politicians, business owners, grandmas and grandpas, young millennials, can find a way to leverage whatever platform they may have or influence they may have and bring some healing. I've been in some small chats with Dr. Mathis Uwanago about, can she recruit 3 or 4 counselors to volunteer maybe an hour or 2 a week, and we'll provide space at our property and just invite medical professionals to come in and talk. Just to say maybe that's a way they can deal with some of what, because you'd mentioned, I think before we went live, about a friend of yours that is a nurse, but they're having to be a hospice nurse now, and they're having to set up technology for families to say goodbye to each other. So
yeah,
I want to be a part of that. When you talked a second ago about how do we shape this new normal, that's part of what I want to be a part of that. And I think one of the things that I love about you, Rob, and you mentioned it earlier, that you have 5 adopted children, that you and your wife live this message. You just don't talk about it. I mean, you guys live it. You've lived it for a long time. So I want to transition our talk into something that I've had the privilege to observe through our friendship, and that is the strength of your commitment, your family's commitment to Jesus, and the outworking of his abolitionist heart on the earth. That in that sense, God is an abolitionist, that the truth and the truth shall set you free, that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. And I know that you and your family have a strong Christian roots and faith. You talked earlier about praying. You've shared powerful messages at our church about hope and compassion. Who is your neighbor? I think our listeners would love to hear about, if you wouldn't mind maybe rolling back take us back into the old photo album of Rob as a kid.
You don't want to see that.
I do want to see that. I totally want to see that. I would just love to hear, maybe our listeners would love to hear a little bit of your family history and what was the role of Jesus in your family, your upbringing. I just want to say that one of the most amazing moments about my friendship with you was a couple of years ago now, 2.5 years ago, your dad died. Something like that.
Yeah. It'll be 3 years actually.
Yeah. Me and a friend came down to your dad's graveside service, and I know that your family is a mixed race family, your children, and I didn't know that was unique to you, but to see your brothers have done the same thing, have adopted children of a different ethnic background, ethnicity, of different race. I felt cheated that I didn't get to know your dad, because I was struck to the place of emotional staggering. Like, what kind of man raises boys that lead these kind of lives of tremendous devotion, sacrifice, integrity? I would love to know more about your childhood and your dad and the role of faith in your family.
Wow. So, I don't even know where to start with that. I was raised in a family that, we started out where our family went to church, but there was no life to it. It was just sort of like, that's the thing you do on Sunday. It's sort of my mom and dad are from that generation, whereas that's just sort of like you go to work Monday through Saturday and you go to church on a Sunday morning. It wasn't, I don't ever remember hearing the gospel preached or anything like that. So, but then slowly but surely, different people in my family started encountering God in some pretty amazing ways, being my mom and dad, and then my older brother. And so I actually thought that they had lost their minds when there was like these radical conversion type things. But
Where did you live during this time, Rob? Just
New
to give folks
York,
maybe a context. Yeah, New York. So
yeah.
it's not
So
like you're coming from a conservative bastion geography.
no, no, and I mean, and I did the whole. I was the classic rebellious teenager. I rejected my parents' values, most of my parents' values, and did my own thing. And yeah, and I was that person. I was a bit of a jerk. But I think two things that I think of that were moments for me of clarity in sort of my worst days when I was a real mess. I remember one night coming home and I was pretty messed up on some things. And I was always fighting with my parents and everything. And my parents were always grounding me and trying to figure out how to straighten my life out. My mom wanted me to go to Teen Challenge. She wanted me to go to AA and all of these different things to try to fix me. Would send me on these spiritual retreats to try to fix me. And I remember there were times when I would go out with my friends. I would put like, you know, a Black Sabbath cassette tape or in my tape deck, and it was Christian music. And my parents, unbeknownst to me, had taped over all my Black Sabbath tapes with like Christian music. And I remember being with my friends, and my friends were like, "What the heck is this stuff?" I'm like, "I don't know." And it was just this whole thing.
Russ
Um,
Taff instead of Black Sabbath.
oh yeah, yeah, right, exactly. And but I remember this one night I came home and I was a mess, and I went into my bedroom and I heard this sound coming from my parents' room, and it was the sound of my mom and dad just sobbing
Mm,
because of me.
mm,
And there was something that hit me in that moment of, man, I'm breaking the hearts of the ones who love me more than anyone, you
mm,
know? And at some point in my life, coming to that place too of recognizing that's kind of what maybe God thinks too. That when I go my own way and do my and I'm breaking the heart of the one who loves me more than anyone. And so there was that kind of moment. And then there was another time when we got into this big blow up, me and my dad. And I was like, that's it. I'm gone. I'm out. I can't handle this anymore. And I got into this raging fight with my dad, and I stormed out of the house. I went into the garage to get into my car, and at first my dad was like, fine, then leave, leave then and stuff. And I'm like, I am. And I go out, I get into my car, and it was at night. And I remember I get in the car, start the car, and I put the car in reverse, and I look in the rearview mirror to back out of the garage. And my rearview lights light up the figure of my dad standing behind my car. And he's sobbing again. He's like, I'm not letting you go. I love you. I love you, like this. And
wow.
and I just lost it right there in the car at this radical act of my my dad. And so moments like that help shape a lot of my direction, moving away from a life of self-obsession to a different way of looking at God and looking at my parents and all of that. So yeah. And my dad loved well. He loved his wife well, loved us well. And I think that was, I mean, most of the time, my sort of like little self-evaluation thing that I do at the end of every day is asking those two questions of myself. Have I loved well today? And was I about the things that matter?
Yeah.
And it took, I'm going to be 58, in a month, but it's taken 58 years or so to get to a place where I've boiled all the complexities of my life down to, those two questions,
Yeah.
to simplify how I'm choosing to live my life. And even the evolution of even my walk with God has been in my relationship with God. I mean, you start out with this moral code kind of way of looking at the Christian life, and then you start to actually read the teachings of Jesus and who he preferred to be with, and all of that, and you start seeing the heart of a God who is so attracted to the marginalized, to the oppressed, to the vulnerable. And it's like, in so many ways, I feel like I missed a huge chunk of my Christian life, was trying so hard not to do it wrong.
Yeah.
Right. It was like I was obsessed with not doing it wrong and trying to do the right thing, and again, it was all this like moral code kind of thinking. And then you start to actually look at the life of Jesus. I mean, you were saying before, it's not about your words, it's about how you live your life. And you see, I mean, who did Jesus, when you read about his life, who was he with? You know, I remember somebody making the statement, as a friend of mine from Britain. He said, man, if you were to, he was always with the marginalized by preference. He was only with the religious by invitation.
Mm.
You know, the religious and the wealthy and the people that thought they had it together.
Mm.
He was with them by invitation. But if he had a preference, and if he preferred to be, the people that he sought out to be with were not those people. And so I'm like, wow, how did I get that wrong for so long? Or how did I miss this whole heart for the marginalized and the oppressed, and his heart for justice and all of that? And so yeah, that's kind of been the journey I've been on, especially in the last 10 or 15 years or so. And part of it has to do with being involved in the work that I do now, right? It's like, wow, this has opened my eyes to so much. And I'm hoping that I'm growing more tender,
Mm.
that I'm growing more tender hearted.
Mm.
And that's why I don't have time anymore for social media fights and weird stuff. Like, I mean, it's just like, man, I don't know. I just look at, you know, I've one of my favorite paintings in the world is Rembrandt's depiction of the return of the prodigal son. And Henry Nouwen wrote a brilliant book called The Return of the Prodigal, based on his meditation on sitting in the museum where that actual painting was hanging, and he was given individual access to spend time with that painting, and he analyzed it, and he meditated on it, and he talked to God about it, and he splits his book into the three key people in that painting, right? The first part is on the prodigal son. And I remember reading that. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's me. That's my story, you know? And then then the second part of the book is about the older brother. And I'm like, oh, that's actually me. You know, that there's that, you know, trying so hard to be right. Oh man, what a freedom has come in my life since I've let that one go. Right. The need to be right is just not of interest to me anymore, but it is to so many. And it was for me for a long time. That's the older brother. Right. And it's just that self-right. Hey, what about me? I've done all the right. So I then identifying with that, but then that last section of the book is on the father. And if you look at that painting and read that particular section, looking at that painting of the father, and his hands on his son, who's just disheveled and just broken at his feet, but the tenderness in this father, I'm thinking, that's who I want to be. Yeah, that's who I want to be. And so yeah, it's simplified my life a bit, for sure.
Well, I've been shaped by those two questions that you ask, you know, did I love well today, and was I about the things that mattered? I think those are great questions. I would encourage those that are watching with us tonight, or will watch at a later time, to consider what are their, you know, 2 or 3 questions at the end of the day they can go back to measure their faithfulness to purpose, to calling. And I guess it's one of the things I had for you. Like, how do you remain committed to this work? You see some of the darkest thing that humanity can offer and produce. How do you remain committed to this work? Does it feel like a calling? You know, people talk about, I've had a calling, I feel called to this. Does it feel that way to you? Or
I don't know if it's the actual work that is a calling as much as it is a calling to do justice. I mean, it's the Micah, right? You know, saying this is what God requires of you, right? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk in humility. That to me is the calling. In my context, it happens to be being played out in my actual vocation, which is great. But I think the bigger calling is the calling part.
Do you feel, let me ask you this, do you feel, and this, I want this question to come out right. Do you feel fortunate? I mean, you see some of the darkest things that humanity can offer, and that's not fortunate.
Hmm.
That's not something positive. But if I just take what you just said, that this calling of Micah to love mercy, to walk humbly, to do justice, and that you happen to have a vocation that allows you to do that day in, day out. Do you feel fortunate to have that convergence of those two ideas?
It's a
Well, I'm thinking
great
about a
question.
lot of people in my church. They want to embrace those things, but their vocation, their 9-to-5er, if you will, simply doesn't value those things or doesn't afford those opportunities.
It's a great question, Lance. And it's interesting because I was asked a similar question years ago. I was doing this week-long teaching and on justice issues and all of that. And somebody asked me the question. They said, "Hey, do you have to have a personal encounter with injustice to actually engage in a meaningful way?"
Yeah.
And I wanted to say the right answer, which would be basically, no, you should just obey God who says to do justice, right? I mean, it's like you didn't, but I disproved that with my own life experience, right? I didn't care about justice before. I didn't even know what justice was. I always, when I heard the word justice, I always sort of related it to some kind of judgment type category. It wasn't a beautiful thing to me. Now it's become this beautiful thing, right? But like, I think, and I said, "Hey, can you give me a day to think about this before I just throw an answer out to you? Because I could easily throw the right answer to you, but I'm actually challenged by that question." And so I sort of went back and I started thinking about that. Do you need to have a personal encounter? Does it need to be your vocation? Is there an, and all of that. And this is what I kind of felt through that internal, like, searching with that question, was I felt like God sort of turned that thing around and was like, you know what, for you to have lived your life and to have not personally encountered injustice means that you have spent most of your life insulating and isolating yourself against the pain of your neighbor. And that in and of itself is an injustice. Wow. Boom. I was like leveled by that thought. And it's like, it's true. It's true. I mean, that so much of our life is trying to protect ourselves from this stuff. And that's what's even interesting during this time right now. We're in this feeling of like, how do I protect myself? I'm wearing a mask so I don't get this disease, this virus. I've got gloves and I'm washing my grocery, all of these, we're like bent in that direction of trying to protect, to preserve something. And so sometimes we live our Christian life like that too, right? It's like for some people, I mean, even for a good chunk of my Christian life, it was like a fire insurance policy. This is all about what happens after this life, right? And it's like, wait a second, am I completely missing the point here? And I came to the discovery that I was. So all that to say is, I think it doesn't necessarily mean vocationally. I think we need to find ways that we can immerse ourselves and allow ourselves to be affected by the pain of our neighbor. It's like when I was driving through a neighborhood some time ago and passed a sign on somebody's lawn that said, "Drive like your children live here," right? And I immediately slowed down, Lance, and I started driving more carefully. And then I felt really convicted that I did that. I'm like, wow, what? Just because if it's my child, then I'm going to be more cautious about how I'm driving? Why should that be? You know what I mean? I should care about anyone's child, not just my own, right? But proximity is a real thing, right? It affects us. We engage differently when something is proximate. Like even this COVID thing, I see these people that are out like, oh, I don't care. I'm going to party with my friends. I'm going to do this. I'm going to go and protest the lockdown. I mean, all of this, it's just like, wait, because you haven't necessarily been affected by this yet. You haven't watched somebody gasping for air in the emergency room. You haven't had to hold the iPad up for a family to say goodbye to their loved one yet. That's why you don't care. But man, and this thing comes for you and it affects you or somebody you care about or you love, all of a sudden, bam, now you're engaged, right? So I think we should be challenged by that and say, what can I do? It may not look like my vocation, but what can I do to be affected by the pain of human beings, the pain of my neighbors, that's what Jesus was about, right? That's why he preferred to be with those people.
Yeah.
And those people at the end of the day is actually not those people. It's us.
Yeah.
We just have somehow created this us and them thing that just was never supposed to be. People sometimes think they, I've had people say, wow, you must be really thick skinned dealing with some of the darkest stories imaginable day in and day out. I'm like, no way, man. I'm as thin skinned as they come. And I think I want to stay that way. I want to be affected. And I think that God is thin skinned
Yeah.
as well. I think that God is affected by the pain of human beings and the brokenheartedness of human beings. Yeah, I think, why would we not?
So I'm hearing you communicate the willingness to be affected and impacted by the pain of your neighbor fuels then the work of justice, and to resist that pain, to ignore that pain, to somehow own that pain in a perverted, selfish way is actually the work of injustice. And I'm hearing you
Absolutely.
communicate those things.
Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
And
powerful.
and and I think and it's not just engaging in a way. It it's also with the belief that um, possibly through my action, it's going to look a little different,
Yeah.
right? So it's sort of that whole thinking of yeah, it's the defiant hope thing that I talk about all the
Yeah.
time, right? It's not optimism. I'm not an optimist by any shape or form. I think optimists at times, and I'm not anti-optimist either. I like being around optimists. But I
Why
think
don't you define
sometimes,
why don't you define the difference so the listener knows what you mean by
yeah,
optimist?
well, I think sometimes optimism has a tendency, not all the time, but sometimes optimism has a tendency to move a bit into denial, right? Where it's like you see the harshness of the circumstances or situation or whatever that you're in or facing. And you're just like, it's going to be okay. Everything's going to turn out okay. Everything's going to be all right. And I think there's a tendency to sort of move a little into denial there. Whereas to me, hope, and then when I've added the word defiant to it because it adds something to it, is a little bit different. I think defiant hope, and unfortunately, the word defiant has had a bad rap, right? It's usually used, and we only hear it when it's used in a negative sense, right? If I had $1 for every time that I heard the word defiant from school teachers when I was growing up, or even my own parents at times, I'd be able to fund the work of Love 146 for the next few decades. But it was always a negative thing. You're so defiant. You're a defiant young man. You're defiant. Well, that defiance now is paying off in spades because I've attached it to hope. And to me, defiant hope is way beyond optimism. I think it recognizes the harshness of the reality of the circumstances or situations or injustice or whatever, but insists that it can change and change possibly by my action connected to it, right? So even going back to scripture, I mean, you look at, there's a passage in Isaiah 59 that has always like stunned me in that I used to think nothing could astonish God, right? There's nothing that could shock God. He's seen it all. He's the creator of the universe, right? But there is something that astonishes him, and it's only found in one place that I could find anyway in all of scripture. There's one thing that astonishes God, and it's not what I would have expected it to be. I would think it would be the idea that, like, for instance, in the work that I do, that children are being exploited by human beings for almost the most unimaginable reasons, horrific reasons. That would astonish. But no, in Isaiah 59, it said that God says that, man, I look around and truth is being trampled in the streets and justice is nowhere to be found. But he doesn't say that astonishes him. He says that breaks my heart. But then he goes on and he says, so I looked for somebody to intervene. I looked for somebody to stand between the strong and the weak. And I was astonished. I was shocked. I was stunned that I found no one. To me, there's a mandate there, man, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to be that person that's not found by God when God is seeing the strong preying on the weak and he doesn't find somebody to stand between. He doesn't find somebody to intervene. And so that defiant hope piece is like, man, I insist that change is possible. And it's a pushing against, it's aggressive. It's not passive. Optimism, it tends to be a bit passive. Defiant hope is aggressive. It's action oriented. And the crazy, beautiful thing is I'm learning that from children that we serve,
Mm.
right? For kids that we serve, for some of our kids to wake up in the morning and choose to live another day, it's an act of defiant hope, man. How can I not embrace that? How can I not pursue that kind of thing? Yeah.
What comes to my mind is I heard John Maxwell was quoting another guy. I was listening to a podcast this week or last week, that what the world needs right now is leadership, not motivation. And his distinction between the two was motivation's not enough. Just to stand on the sidelines and cheer people on, sort of this phrase like, we'll all get through this together. We're all going to make it together. We're all going to be together. We're all going to be stronger on the other side. Probably true. And in some sense, we want it to be true. And we hope that that's true. But he was articulating, he goes, people need more than that.
Yeah.
They need someone to show them how to get from here to there, to show them what kind of steps need to be taken to get there, and who's willing to go first, who's willing to do the kind of things that I hear you describing, Rob, about embracing vulnerability, not denying reality. So I can articulate reality as it is, but there's a meta narrative that's greater than that reality. And that's where our defiant hope is rooted. It's what's fueled by, that meta narrative that I can contribute to something that will change this, what is the current reality. I was thinking, I can't remember what book it's from. I was looking at my bookcase. Maybe I have it. The Stockdale Paradox. Are you familiar with that?
Mm-mm.
It may be in Good to Great. It's one of the Jim Collins books, but he talked about Admiral Stockdale was taken POW, I believe it was, during the Vietnam War. And during the Vietnam War, he would have fellow POWs who would, even by the soldiers would say to these prisoners, you may be out by December, or they would catch wind that, hey, we're going to be out by this date, the spring, or we're going to be out by Christmas. And they wouldn't be out by that time. And Admiral Stockdale would talk about how these men, they may literally die at the hands of their POW soldiers, but they really died more of disappointment and a broken heart. Oof. And he developed this thing called the Stockdale Paradox, which was, how do you embrace reality, but not allow it to suffocate your hope? So I want to be out by Christmas, but if I'm not, I still have hope on December 26th. And I was thinking about that as you were sharing about how you're defining defiant hope. Yeah. So what do you do? Can you give us a couple of practices? What do you do to maintain a healthy soul?
Okay, so step one.
Can we transition this to like some really nice couches out in a beautiful green meadow, and imagine Oprah's there, and this could be our soulful Sunday? What do you do, abolitionist, to have a healthy soul?
All right. Oh man, soul care. Man, I read a lot of good stuff.
You have a favorite author?
I've got, oh man, I have a lot of favorite authors. I read good stuff. I try to spend just time quiet. Like I get up in the morning before anybody, and so I have those morning moments of just being still before God. At night, one of the things I've been doing even during this COVID thing and being locked down is, especially in the beginning when there was some anxiety of like, wow, what's this going to mean, and how are we going to survive this as a charity, and all those big thoughts and fears that come with that, is at night, one of the, I'll just put in some music that's soothing to my soul, right? That is reflective, that causes me to think a bit. Having good conversations with people like this is good for my soul. It's like, and I've done several like podcasts in the last couple of weeks with some folks, and I had somebody I was talking to yesterday about it. They were like, "Hey, thanks a lot for doing that podcast. All this and everything." I'm like, "No, man, that was good. That was better for me than it was for you, probably." I said it was like therapy for me to be able to just have conversations about things that matter like this. It's good for my soul. Surrounding myself with good people is good for my soul. So yeah, so just being intentional. And I think also limiting people's opinions on news has been really good for my soul, because it could really be damaging to my soul. I'm weeding out things that are toxic, right? That I just know are toxic to my soul and just get me angry or fueling, parts of me that I just don't like being fueled. And maybe in some ways I do like those things being fueled. So I know that. And so it's like, oh man, I feel myself, it's like sometimes my daughter years ago, I used to put on specific talk radio that would make me angry to listen to it. And I would turn it on and I'd start like shouting at the radio. This was years ago. My daughter finally was like, Dad, why do you do this to yourself? And I'm like, that's a great question. I don't know. And so I've sort of like eliminated a lot of that. When I feel some of those things that I think can move into a place that's not healthy for me or for whoever might be on the receiving end of something that I might want to add to my own 2 cents to, I bail, man. I'm just like, it's time is too valuable. It's just too valuable. And I didn't understand that like I do now. And I'm understanding it to a greater degree as I'm getting older. I live, my house is right across from these apartment buildings that have mostly elderly people living in them. And for the last 20 years we've lived here, and my wife and I have noticed there are definitely two kinds of people. There's two ways of growing older. There are those who have become very bitter, and I don't know all of their stories. I've talked to some, and some of their stories, you can understand why there's been a bitterness that has developed some roots. And then there's those that, man, you just want to be around them. My daughter, who works on an ambulance, drove a 106-year-old lady home from the hospital the other day. She drove her from the hospital back to the apartment buildings and stuff. And she said, man, 106 years. She goes, what's the secret of living a long life? And this lady said, behave, be kind, and do the right thing. She said, my daughter said she didn't even have to think about it. She like had the answer like that, right? And she said there was an just this beautiful countenance on this 106-year-old lady. How did she grow old like that? And so we've sort of made these decisions of like, this is how I want to age. I want to be like the fine wine kind of thing, that maybe I'll become more merciful and more tender and more compassionate and more forgiving, rather than this other thing. And I think if the more I'm feeding my soul with the other thing and the toxicity and stuff, and I'm not afraid of that stuff, I just don't think it's good for my soul. And I know what I believe and what I want to care about. And again, it comes down to that question of, was I about the things that matter? I mean, nobody gets to the end of their life and writes on their tombstone, I was right a lot of the time. That's a pretty lame legacy. And unless you're like a lawyer or something like that, I guess maybe that's good. But yeah, it's like, but something like you were at my dad's funeral, right? I mean, his testimony, I mean, there weren't thousands of people there, but the people that were impacted by my dad would all say the same thing. He loved well.
Yeah.
Boy, there's a legacy there, man. Whew.
Huge. I'm thinking about the times I do something similar to Rob. Maybe I'm on cable TV news too much, or just listening to the negative stuff too much. And when I do what Brene Brown calls rumble with it, like what's really underneath the behavior? Why am I doing that? What I realize usually 90% of the time, majority of the time, is I'm feeling powerless. And my listening to this commentator on TV that I know I'm going to disagree with, I then can feel powerful by arguing with someone that can't argue back.
Wow. Yeah. There you
And
go.
then I feel right. And then I feel powerful. And then I feel like, man, I'm really making a difference. And it's a straw man. And deep down, I know that, but I'm so not hungering for power in a negative way, but it's the sense of, I just can't I just can't live powerless. I can't live not believing that I can do something to affect the topography of whatever it is we're facing.
I think I think sometimes it makes us feel more alive to be angry, right? I mean, it's like,
There are days when I'm angry, I feel more alive,
right,
and I
right,
just
yeah.
choose to be angry.
Yeah. You get the jitters if you didn't get angry today about something, right? So you hit your Twitter feed or it's interesting. I was thinking you're hitting on something I think that's really, really important. And in that, the other day I was doing just some poking around because there's all these like conspiracy theory things that are going around and stuff in times like this, right? I was just like, what is this? Why are people attracted to conspiracy theories? What is it about? And so I did some poking around into it, like Psychology Today and these different things of like, what is there something about this? And it's exactly what you're saying. It's actually they say that people are attracted to that stuff because they want to feel that they've got some control in chaos.
Yeah.
When something gets to be chaotic or whatever, if I can make sense, if I can find something that, ooh, this makes sense of that, there's a feeling I can control it. Or even like the power thing, right? I mean, I'm thinking, man, I see people and believers, right, who are so attracted to power. Like, if we had enough power, we can make changes,
Yeah.
right? If we had enough political power, if we had enough of the right judges, if we had the right this and all this, I'm like, wait, man, didn't Jesus completely turn those tables upside down and show another way? That was not the way of power, but the way of humility, the way of serving, the servant, right? I mean, all of that, and a way of love. I mean, it's exactly the stuff that confused some of the disciples, like Judas, right? There was like, wait, this isn't how this is supposed to work, right? It's what we just went through the season the Easter week, right? Of Palm Sunday. I was talking to somebody about, somebody asked me the question was one of the kids that, what changed here in a matter of a week, right? You had these people, and we did a little celebration here in our house of Palm Sunday. This is what Palm Sunday is. And, and people welcoming him, this is it. Here, he's here. The Messiah is here. The King is here. This is good. But there was this expectation that people had of what a Messiah is supposed to look like, right? An expectation of how the King is supposed to, he's going to set up a new thing. There's going to be, now we've got the power, right? And what does he do? He gets off the donkey and he tears the temple apart. And it's like, wait, that's not how this is supposed to go down. You're supposed to go set up your throne. And that's not what happens. And so very quickly, those hosannas turn to crucify him. He's not living up to our religious expectations. And when I see this, when I see a thirst in believers for power more than a thirst for humility and compassion, and the marginalized and all of that, and think that somehow if we get enough power, then we can, people clamoring for a seat at the table of power. That's the absolute opposite of the upside down kingdom that Jesus introduced. Mm. It's not about clamoring for a seat at the table of power. It's not. But I think that feeling of control, if I can control, we can get some control here. And I mean, even that, somebody asked me in one of the podcasts that I did recently about if you could ask like one question and have it answered, what would it be? And that's a great question, right? What one question? And there's all those big, deep theological, why do the innocent suffer? Why do, all these, things that I would normally, and Lance, I think I've come to a place where I don't know if I have any anymore. Like because I've been learning the value of embracing mystery.
Totally.
Rather than trying to figure it out and have all the answers. And I've found more joy, more contentment than I ever have before. Yeah. And we think, though, if we could get those answers, or if we could fix the broken thing, that, man, then we'll have the joy that sense of contentment and satisfaction. And I think it's just the opposite. If we have just enough power, then we can get the change. Maybe not.
Yeah, I'm with you. As you were talking, I was thinking about what an acquaintance of mine said one time. And he was particularly speaking to a Christian audience, but he made that statement. He said, Christians don't do well with mystery. They don't do well with mystery. And he goes, there has to be a certain element of mystery that you allow for in your life, because that's the space that God fills. He fills the space of mystery with himself. He fills it with that sense of, I'm going to show you who I am. And so defiant hope and somehow is rooted in a God that fills mysterious places with himself. Because if I have it all figured out, then I don't need him.
Right. Right.
I don't
And
really need him.
things haven't changed for 2,000 years, right? I mean, that was the offense that Jesus was to the religious mindset and religious people, was exactly that. You want to be able to domesticate God, and it ain't gonna happen, man. You're not gonna have it. It's not you. He won't be controlled, man. It's just not gonna happen.
And I've lived, and probably more than I even still want to admit, live that moral code. And I would, that for me, that's what I would define as kind of the unhealthy religious aspect of, there's this moral code. And if I can live the moral code and ascend to seats of power where I can exercise control, because really underneath all of that is fear of not being good enough, fear of not being lovable, fear of not being worthy, fear of chaos, fear of being injured, or hurt in some way. I want to control all of that. And power seems to be one way in which I can do that. And not just power, but living really hard and fast to try to get on my tombstone, I was always right. is the other way to have intellectual power. And I think that's really rich. And I hope that the community that I lead can, to whatever influence God may give them in the social aspect, my hope is they can find the way of humility, and hope that God will be merciful to us in our own ways of still being religious, and we don't know it yet, and he'll be merciful to us. One last question for you, because I know you're connected to other global leaders, and you've got team in other parts of the globe. You're doing podcasts, you're hearing from lots of other sources. Is there a consistent theme you feel like you've heard, Rob, about what's going on in the world? And I'm not asking you what's the why behind this thing, but is there a consistent narrative that you're hearing, a cry, if you will, from the earth for something that which God, through his redeemed believers, could offer the world?
Boy, I don't know about a common theme. I think, if anything, and again, I even see a pushing back against this as well. I mean, it's interesting. My oldest son, Tyler, just sent a text we have a family chat text thing, and he sent a thing tonight, and he was just seeing some of these images online of people doing crazy, hateful things and stuff. And he's like, man, he goes, of all times, this is the time that there is this connectedness, that the whole world is facing a common enemy. So you would think that this is the time that there would be a recalibration of what's important and what's not important, right? And it is happening. I mean, there is less like, okay, things that were really important. I find it even in our meetings, right? The things that we were meeting about that seemed so important a couple months ago now have taken a back seat. They're low down on the priority list. So it may be a prioritizing of our common humanity, that we are on this boat together. And rather than kicking just into self-survival mode and, taking a lifeboat out, figuring out how we could work together to make it through this storm. And I think even some of the folks I'm talking to in other charities, I've been really encouraged, because I think there is an uncertain future facing charities right now, financial future. I mean, we're looking at what cuts are we going to need to start making like now, that can sustain this thing so that we don't um, cut back on our services. And they're really hard conversations. And we're not alone. Charities, churches, everyone's having these conversations. But I think there's this feeling of like, wow, I'm really glad I'm not alone in this. And there's something about that. What affects one human? It's the proximity thing again. Drive like your children live here. Maybe that's what's happening right now, is there is an identifying with the proximity of like, this isn't something that's happening to just a small village someplace far, far, far away from here. This is happening in my own communities. I look, Lance, I'm looking into the eyes of people past their face masks. And I told my wife this the other night. I came back from Stop and Shop the other night, and I'm like, I haven't noticed like people's eyes in a long time.
It's all you have.
I'm noticing, and I'm looking, and you see people. Oh man, it's hard, especially some of the older folks, man, that I'm looking at, that have this look of panic and uncertainty and fear, and you're seeing, and there's this relating that's happening, right, of like these eye connections of like, yeah, you're surviving too, huh? Yeah, you're surviving too. If we could figure out, and I know that this is like pipe dream stuff, right, I guess we could figure out how to do it better together.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a moment for the church. And that's why it's like, I have this deep, deep concern of are we going to be who we were destined to be? Or are we just going to be part of all the other noise that just isn't really solving anything? I don't know. I mean, I'm just rambling now, but I just think there's this interconnectedness moment right now that is such a rare, possibly once in a lifetime experience. I mean, I remember when 9/11 happened, and being a New Yorker, born and raised in New York, I watched those towers get built. And I remember the feeling right after 9/11 in New York. I mean, there was a sense of in this together. I mean, New Yorkers, we were looking at each other and like, hey man, we got, we're going to survive. We're going to do this. We're going to, and there was this, like, people were kind. There was this, and it was like that for some time. And then eventually that moment wore off, and we were back to the same old, same old. So I don't know. I think there's I think there's going to be interesting opportunities right now and in the next probably couple of years. And we're going to be having to make some decisions as individual people. I think as a church, I think as nations, and as a world, of what kind of world do we want to live in, man? What kind of world do we want to live in?
I agree with you. I do feel it has felt a little like whiplash for about 4 or 5 weeks, just a total disorientation about how, to me, how sudden this has felt, and how deeply dramatic it is. As I was sharing with you before we started, in some ways my life, day-to-day rhythms hasn't really been that disrupted. But there's a deep emotional disruption, a deep life disruption. I mean, thousands and thousands of people have lost loved ones, and that's not to be overlooked or marginalized in any way. But I don't have a good grasp on how deep this has affected the world. But I do feel like out of nowhere, we all of a sudden have this common humanity. That I look at Iranians who are just as afraid of the COVID virus as I may be. Or I look at, Filipinos or Europeans or Guatemalans or Kenyans. And I can hope, and I'm not sure I have hope. I ought to have hope, but I'm not for sure I do have hope, if I'm honest. But I want to have hope that our politicians, those voices of a nation, can in some way find that humanity and broker the kind of alliances and camaraderies and serving of each other that would make our world a better place. I was flipping through a friend's website today, and while you were talking, I thought of these things. He wrote these words down from 2016 He divides it into 7 categories: Jesus, time, context, friendship, work, reflection, Sabbath. And he has a little phrase that he felt for each one. I thought these are so beautiful. So his word for the year with Jesus was dive deep. For time, focused presence. For context, simplify. For work, do what I was created for. Reflection, pursue wisdom. Sabbath, settle into the forever rhythm. And then this one is what really came to my mind, Rob, while you were talking. Friendship, seek the imago Dei. Look for the image of God in every other person.
Yeah.
Because they're made in his image. And I think the masks in some ways are parables. You know, we've been wearing masks for a long, long time. But I was reading today about how the eyes are the window to the soul in the gospel. So,
I mean, do you think you'll ever look at a grocery clerk the same after this, right? I mean, people that normally may have gone unnoticed to
minimum wage workers, like,
and obviously the vulnerable are even more vulnerable right now. So, yeah, I mean, it's like there's some things that there's a recalibration that's taking place that you hope will last, right?
a friend of mine from Kenya posted a picture. She's been working in Kenya for 20 or 30 years, mainly in Nairobi. And she posted a picture of a mountain. I don't know the name of the mountain that sits outside Nairobi, pretty good ways, but you could see it in this picture. And she said, in all of my years of coming to Nairobi, this was the first time I've ever seen that mountain from the city because of the pollution and the smog. And I thought, that's it, Pop, Lord. You are allowing us to see something we've never been able to see before. Because our vision has been clouded at our own doing. Like we did it. We did the clouding of our own vision. And I want to see the grocery clerk different. I do. I want to see people different. And I would connect, for me, Rob, I would connect that back to your thought earlier. Am I willing to feel deeper discomfort or pain, or am I willing to, I shared with you too before we started about the loss happening in our church and how I need to refer to Brene Brown's work on empathy, because it doesn't feel natural to me, but I want it to be natural. And so I've got to practice these skills until they become more natural skills for me. And I need God to change my heart in that. I need God to change my heart in that. I can't do it. Even a circumstance can't do it, but I know God could use a circumstance to change my heart. So that's what I want. And I hope for the same thing you hope for. That's why I love talking to you, Rob, my friend, my brother.
Likewise, man.
You are just one of my favorite people in all the world.
Thanks, man.
Please give my love and my wife's love and our church love to your family. And we just bless you guys with health in your home, your daughter, particularly on the front lines.
Thank you.
And we just pray that this time would be really rich for your family with Jesus and with each other, and that the legacy you inherited from your dad would be the legacy you're passing on to your kids as well.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the time, my friend.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Bless you guys. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, man.
Okay, bye.
Good night.